The gray stallion had already put 2 men in the ground before Phoebe Raines walked into his pen, and the moment she crossed the fence rail he stopped moving entirely, ears forward, head low, breathing out through his nose like something inside him had just gone quiet for the first time in months. Dax Merritt had his rifle up before she cleared the top rung. He didn't know her. A woman who had no business being there, in a coat too large and too ruined for the weather, hair pressed flat against her face by what looked like 3 days of continuous rain. He didn't shoot, because the gray, Smoke, the horse the army had written off and that Dax had nearly put down twice since November, was pressing his nose toward her outstretched palm like he was expecting something gentle. Dax had been ready to shoot that horse by Friday. He lowered the rifle and watched instead. Phoebe didn't reach for Smoke right away. She stood at the center of the pen, water running off her coat hem, and waited. 4 minutes. Dax counted. When the stallion finally walked to her and pressed his broad face against her chest, she brought one hand up to his jaw like she'd been doing it her whole life. "Stone bruise," she said without turning. "Left front. He's been hurting for weeks. That's what's been making him fight." Dax stepped down off the fence. "Who are you?" She turned. Dark eyes, steady as a carpenter's level, and an expression that wasn't pride or fear. Just the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time. "My name is Phoebe Raines," she said. "I need somewhere to sleep. I can work for it." He looked her over. The ruined boots, the way she held her weight slightly right to favor her left ankle, the careful stillness of someone who'd learned not to make unnecessary movements, a woman running from something. Any other morning he'd have sent her off the land and not thought twice. But Smoke still hadn't moved. The horse stood with his neck low and his eyes half closed, the way a sick animal stands when something has finally relieved the pain. "Bunkhouse," Dax said. "We'll settle the rest come morning." Phoebe had been walking for 11 days when she found the Merritt place, and before that, she'd been moving most of her adult life. Her mother had worked the frontier midwife circuit between Cheyenne and Laramie, traveling by wagon to ranches and settlements where doctors didn't come and babies didn't wait. She'd taken Phoebe along from the time Phoebe was old enough to be useful, and she'd taught her everything she knew: how to read when a labor was going wrong before the visible signs showed, how to bring a frightened animal down with voice and stillness alone, how to tell infection by smell 2 days before the fever broke. It wasn't mystical, it was attention of the kind most people were too busy or too frightened to practice. Her mother died of a fever the winter Phoebe turned 16. After that, Phoebe worked alone, moving where she was needed. She'd made a mistake in Claro Basin, not a medical one. She'd done everything right, ridden hard when the Lund family sent for her, stayed through a difficult labor, made a decision nobody wanted made in order to save the mother. The baby came early and small and spent 3 days in the balance before it held on. Mother recovered. Baby thrived. Phoebe collected her wages and prepared to move on. Then Bernard Lund, the rancher's older brother who held the local bank, decided the family needed someone to blame for the fear they'd felt during those 3 days. He told the town Phoebe had been careless, then reckless, then drunk. Then he told the sheriff she'd stolen jewelry from the bedside table during the birth. There was no missing jewelry, but Bernard Lund owned the bank and the sheriff owed him money, and by the time Phoebe understood what was being built around her, a warrant was already being drafted with her name at the top. She left before dawn on a borrowed horse. She rode north for 4 days until the horse went lame in the mud outside Ridgecroft, sold it for $11 in her good coat, and walked the rest of the way wrapped in a dead man's army surplus jacket until the rain finished what the road had started. She hadn't planned on the horse. She just needed 1 night out of the weather. By the 3rd morning, she'd cleaned and packed the stone bruise with materials she found in the tack room, fashioned a soft boot from leather scraps, and begun the slow, desensitizing work with Smoke. Cruz Molina, the only hand Dax had left after the rest quit in November, came and stood at the fence rail on the 4th afternoon without being asked. "My grandfather in Sonora had a horse like this one," Cruz said. "Mean to his bones. They shot him." "Wrong call," Phoebe said. "I know that now." He watched her run the lead rope in slow circles at Smoke's shoulder. "How long before he'll take a rider?" 3 weeks, maybe 4. Cruz looked over at Dax, who was leaning on the far fence with his arms crossed. Dax had an army contract. 40 Mustangs to deliver, broke to saddle by the 1st of April. With Smoke settled, the other horses had calmed considerably. The timeline was brutal, but no longer impossible. "What do you want for wages?" Dax asked. "Room and board to start. Whatever's fair after you see the work." He named a figure. It was more than fair. She nodded. They didn't shake on it, just went back to what they were doing, which felt like its own kind of agreement. Bix Tannen, the youngest hand at 17 and still figuring himself out, watched her the way people watch something they've been told isn't possible happening right in front of them. He didn't say much, but he stopped disappearing when she came around, which she took as progress. At night, Dax worked at his desk, and Phoebe sat in the bunkhouse and tried not to think about Claro Basin. The accusation moved through her like a splinter she couldn't reach, not constant pain, but a persistent wrongness that surfaced in the quiet. She'd done the right thing. She knew that. It didn't help as much as it should have. Genevieve Stahl arrived on a Tuesday in a rented carriage from Ridgecroft, and the first thing she did was look at the ranch the way a person looks at something they're pricing. Her husband held a land commissioner's position and handled acquisition for the Northern Pacific's secondary lines. Genevieve, as far as Phoebe could piece together, did the work her husband found distasteful. She was good at it. She had the particular skill of making people feel genuinely heard right up until the moment they realized she'd been recording everything they said. "I heard you were struggling with the contract," she said to Dax, standing in the yard with her gloves held correctly in one hand. "I came to see if my husband could help." "I'm not selling," Dax said. Nobody mentioned selling. Her eyes had already found Phoebe, crossing the yard with a bucket of grain. "Who is that?" "Ranch hand." She watched Phoebe the way a cat watches something it hasn't yet decided about. Strange time of year to be hiring. She stayed in Ridgecroft and came out 3 more times that week. On her 4th visit, she spent 20 minutes talking with Bix near the water trough while Phoebe worked the far pen and couldn't hear. Bix didn't meet her eyes at dinner. Cruz told her that evening, plainly. "She's been in town asking about you, where you came from, why you left Claro Basin." He paused. "Men like Bernard Lund talk to men like Albert Stahl. That's how it works. She's telling people you killed a woman in childbirth and ran before they could hold you for it." "The woman is alive." Phoebe's voice came out level, which surprised her. "The daughter turned 4 months old last week." "I know it. Dax knows it." Cruz studied the middle distance. "He sent 2 telegrams the morning after you showed up." She went to find Dax. He was in the barn running his hands down the hip of a roan mare who'd been favoring her left side. He looked up when Phoebe came through the door. "You checked on me," she said. "I did." "And?" "Bernard Lund's sister-in-law is alive. The warrant was filed 3 days after you left, drafted by Lund himself. The telegraph office clerk remembered it because it was unusual for a private citizen to draft it personally. He went back to the roan. Genevieve is moving against you because she needs me off this land, and she figures if she can get you gone, I come apart. She's not wrong that I'm a liability." "She's wrong about what I do with liabilities." Dax set down the brush and looked at her. "I don't run from problems, Miss Raines. I solve them." He said it the way he said everything, without particular heat, like it was simply a condition of things he'd already decided. Phoebe stood in the doorway of the barn and felt something shift inside her she couldn't quite name, the unfamiliar weight of being somewhere a person had already thought about keeping her. The deputy came from Ridgecroft on a gray Thursday with a warrant, and 2 men flanking him she didn't recognize. She saw them coming from the high pasture, handed the bay's lead rope to Bix, who received it with a face full of guilt he didn't know how to carry, and walked down to meet them. The charge was theft, $40 from Dax's desk and a forged supply order, clean and simple and completely invented, with Genevieve herself listed as the witness. Dax read the warrant. Something moved across his face, not surprise, but the arithmetic of a man calculating options quickly. "I'm not filing a complaint. There's no complaint here." "Third party filed it, Mr. Merritt. My hands are tied." "Don't," Phoebe said to Dax quietly. He looked at her. His jaw was set, and she could see him building towards something she needed him not to do. "Go work the horses," she said. "The contract doesn't stop." They put her in the second cell of the Ridgecroft jail, which smelled like rust and old straw. She sat on the cot and folded her hands and made herself think clearly. Genevieve was careful. Whatever she'd manufactured would be consistent. Dax's word against hers would only complicate him. But Genevieve had known things about the ranch's supply ordering that weren't public knowledge. She'd known how the ledger was kept, what the supply amounts typically ran. Someone had told her. Phoebe thought about Bix at the water trough, not meeting her eyes. Not malice. The boy was 17 and Genevieve Stahl knew exactly how to make a lonely person feel like they mattered. She asked the deputy for paper and a pen. He looked surprised enough that he handed both over. She wrote 2 sentences, folded the paper, and passed it back. "Can you get that to Dax Merritt?" The deputy looked at it a long moment, then pocketed it without answering. She decided that was the best she was going to get. The note reached Dax before midnight. Bix didn't mean harm, he was used. Ask him what she asked about the supply orders. Dax went to the bunkhouse. It took 15 minutes of careful, unhurried questions to get the shape of it. Genevieve had asked Bix about ranch operations in that friendly way she had, how the ordering worked, how the ledger was maintained, who handled the money besides Dax. She'd done it while asking after the boy's family and complimenting his work, and Bix hadn't understood what he'd been feeding her until he saw the warrant with Phoebe's name on it. He cried. Dax sat with him until he was finished. Then he rode to Ridgecroft and found Margaret Chen at 2 in the morning, which she took with the equanimity of a woman who'd handled things at worse hours for less reason. Margaret went to work. By dawn she had the supply order in question, found in the actual ledger, signed legitimately, dated 12 days before Phoebe had set foot on the ranch. By mid-morning she had a telegraph deposition from the Claro Basin operator confirming the warrant's timeline. And then she found the letter, Bernard Lund to Albert Stahl 4 months prior, requesting that if the woman from the Claro Basin matter appeared in Stahl's territory, she be discouraged from remaining. Not explicit. Not quite a confession, but combined with everything else, a picture that required no imagination to understand. The hearing was held the next afternoon. Genevieve arrived composed. She stopped looking composed about 20 minutes in. Margaret was methodical and without warmth. She walked the judge through the ledger, the telegraphs, and the letter in that order, reading the last one aloud, slowly enough that no one could miss the meaning. Then Bix Tannen took the stand, and with the look of a person choosing something that cost him, told the court exactly what Genevieve had asked, and in what order she'd asked it. The judge, a man named Whalen, who had the air of someone long tired of a particular kind of case, dismissed the charges in 8 words. There is no credible evidence of any crime. Then he set down his pen and looked at Genevieve's attorney over his glasses. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the Federal Land Office for review of acquisition practices in this district. I'd suggest your client and her husband not make any immediate travel arrangements. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon was cold and particular, the kind of early spring day that feels like it was earned rather than given. Phoebe stood on the steps and let the sun hit her face. Her wrists still showed the marks. She'd need to care for a bruise on her knee from the cot. Dax was at the bottom of the steps. He'd been in the back row of the hearing the entire time, and she'd felt him there the way you feel a fire when you're cold, not looking at it directly but aware of the warmth. Margaret's bill goes to the ranch, he said. I'll work it off. You don't have to. I want to. She came down the steps, watching the mud. Genevieve's husband still wants this valley. He'll try again through proper channels. Let him. Dax said it with the same flat certainty he brought to everything. The deed's mine, the water rights are mine, and in 6 weeks I deliver 40 army horses, which matters more to people's decisions about who to trust than any railroad commissioner's opinion. Cruz appeared from somewhere with her coat over his arm. He'd brought it from the ranch without being asked. He handed it to her and went to see about the horses. Dax stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize as him working towards something he wasn't certain how to say. Stay, he said finally, after the contract delivers. There's year-round work here if you want it. Phoebe looked at him. She'd been waiting, without knowing it, for the familiar sensation of being somewhere temporary, the rehearsed lightness of keeping herself ready to leave. She waited for it now, and it didn't come the way it usually did. The Lund warrant might not dissolve fast, she said. Then we deal with it. I might be more trouble then. I've seen how you work, Dax said. I've watched you bring horses back from places they were finished. I watched you hold still in that pen and wait for an animal that had killed men to decide you were safe, and you were right. And I've been wrong about a lot of things, but I'm not wrong about that. He stopped. You're not trouble. You're the reason I still have a contract. Phoebe looked at the mud, at the hills beyond the town, at the sky going pale above the ridgeline. She'd looked at a lot of skies from a lot of places. She was trying to work out what was different about this one. I'll think on it, she said. Not yes, but not no, and they both understood the distance between them. 6 weeks later, the army took delivery of 38 horses. The colonel who oversaw the inspection rode Smoke himself at the end, the gray stallion standing quiet and responsive under a stranger, and afterward he shook Dax's hand, then turned to Phoebe and shook hers too, which was not how these things were usually done. Where'd you learn this? He asked. My mother, she said. He nodded, because that was a complete answer. That evening, the ranch was quiet in a way it hadn't been in months. Crews made dinner. Bix found small, unnecessary tasks to do in the yard, which Phoebe understood was his way of slowly making something right. Dax came and leaned on the fence of the empty training pen beside her and watched the hills go dark. "You thought on it," he said. "I have." She had. She'd thought about what it felt like to put something down after carrying it so long, you'd stopped noticing the shape of it. She'd thought about her mother, who had said more than once that the work wasn't what wore you out. It was doing it alone. She'd thought about a gray horse pressing his face against her chest in the early morning rain, and a man who'd checked the facts before he'd decided to trust her, and what it meant that those two things had happened in the same place. "I'm staying," she said. Dax exhaled, the specific sound of a man releasing something he'd held onto for longer than was comfortable. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. They went inside for dinner. The door was open and the lamp was burning, and there was room at the table for everyone who'd earned a place at it. That was how it started. Not the end of hard things. The Lund warrant took another year to clear, and the stall interests came back twice before they finally moved on. But a start solid enough to build from, which was all she'd ever needed. Phoebe Raines had walked onto that land with nothing her accusers would have counted as valuable. She'd had knowledge her mother gave her and the patience to use it, and the refusal to believe that other people's judgment was the final word on what she was worth. It turned out that was exactly enough. It had always been exactly enough. She just needed somewhere quiet enough to find out.